James Whitmore's world was collapsing, and he felt it in his bones before he even saw the numbers. The skyline outside his penthouse glittered under the morning sun, a city alive with ambition, with people chasing dreams he once owned. But inside, the air was heavy. His footsteps echoed across the marble floors, sharp and uneven, betraying a panic he could not contain. His tailored suit clung to him like armor, but it was empty armor now. The man who had built an empire, who had controlled boardrooms and headlines, was staring down ruin, and there was no one to protect him. The walls of his luxurious penthouse seemed to close in, reflecting his own hollow eyes, his own disbelief. He had played the game of power and wealth, and for the first time, he had lost. Completely. The assistant burst in without warning, papers clutched in trembling hands, her own face tight with fear. "James," she began, voice shaking as she handed over the folder, "these are the final reports." Silence fell. The kind of silence that presses down on your chest, that robs you of breath. James barely looked at her. He opened the folder with a trembling hand. The numbers screamed failure at him, screaming louder than any voice could. Bankruptcy. Collapsed deals. Legal battles he hadn't yet processed. Betrayals by those he trusted most. Everything he had built over decades was gone. He whispered, almost to himself, "Everything gone." His fingers drummed against the mahogany desk, but the sound was hollow. He sank into his chair, the weight of loss pressing into his shoulders, into his chest, into his soul. And then she entered. Maria. The cleaning lady. Her steps were soft, purposeful, almost musical in their rhythm, a quiet contrast to the chaos that had overtaken his life. She moved without fanfare, her uniform worn but neat, her hair pulled back in a no-nonsense bun, her eyes steady and observant. She had seen James Whitmore at his peak. She had dusted his offices, polished his silver, seen the sharp pride in his eyes. Now she saw him at his lowest, a titan humbled, a man reduced by circumstance. She bent to wipe a surface, glancing up at him only occasionally, her gaze unflinching. There was dignity in her movements, grace in her silence, a quiet strength that filled the room more than his wealth ever had. James finally looked at her, desperation breaking through his polished exterior. "Do you have any idea what this means?" he asked, voice low but trembling with anger and fear. Maria did not answer right away. She simply continued her work, dusting, arranging, straightening, a silent refusal to be hurried or intimidated. Her calm spoke louder than any words. James's frustration grew, the tension snapping through the room like an approaching storm, threatening to shatter what little control he had left. Then, in a burst of fury, he slammed his fist on the desk, sending papers scattering across the floor. "Everything I built, gone." His voice cracked. The walls themselves seemed to echo the despair, bouncing it back at him. And through it all, Maria paused, straightened, and in a voice quiet but firm said, "Maybe it's not about what's gone, sir. Maybe it's about what's still here." Her words were almost a whisper, but they cut through the roar of his panic like a bell in the silence. James scoffed, bitterness curling around his lips. He could not imagine how the words of someone he had always overlooked, someone who cleaned the floors he walked on, who carried her life in worn shoes and frayed sleeves, could pierce the armor of his pride. Yet, despite himself, he felt a flicker of curiosity. A crack appeared in the walls he had built around his heart. Could this woman, so ordinary in the eyes of the world, be the one to make him see what he could not see? He sank further into the chair, head in hands, staring at the chaos he had created, or that life had created for him. Around him, the room gleamed with the remnants of his empire. Polished wood, sparkling glass, expensive art, but it all mocked him now, a visual reminder of the power and influence he had lost. And still, Maria moved quietly, cleaning, observing, not intruding, but undeniably present. She was a calm in the storm, a reminder that some things endured even when the world seemed to collapse. The contrast was stark. James, who had once held the world in his hands, felt powerless. Maria, who had so little in the eyes of society, carried a strength that James could not ignore. She worked with intention, her movements deliberate, her presence steady. She did not need wealth to assert power. She did not need status to command respect. She simply existed with dignity, and in that existence, she had already begun to teach him the first lesson of his fall, humility. He watched her, the silence stretching between them, heavy but instructive. The hum of the city below, the constant rush of life, felt distant, almost irrelevant. Here, in this room, in this moment, everything that truly mattered was being revealed to him. The man who had conquered boardrooms, who had dictated the fates of thousands, was learning to see the worth of someone society ignored. And the woman who had only ever been tasked with cleaning was quietly, without fanfare, showing him a way forward. James's breathing slowed, though his mind raced. He realized that the world outside would see him as broken, as defeated. But here, in this room, he had a chance to see differently. Perhaps the measure of a person was not in what they controlled, but in what they carried within them when everything else was stripped away. Maria, moving steadily, wiping a counter, adjusting a frame, was the proof. As he leaned back, eyes fixed on her calm face, the audience seized the profound tension. A man who had once believed he was untouchable, staring into the quiet power of someone he underestimated. Something was about to change, something unanticipated, something that would turn his world upside down. The camera lingers on Maria's eyes, steady, knowing, unshaken. She continues her work, unaware of the storm she is quietly calming, unaware that in these simple, deliberate actions, she has already begun to rewrite the fate of a fallen titan. And as the shot widens to show the city sprawling beneath them, glittering in oblivious beauty, one truth becomes painfully clear. Sometimes, the person the world overlooks is the one who can see the way forward. James Whitmore, a man who thought he controlled everything, is about to learn that the smallest, quietest hands can hold the keys to redemption, and that sometimes salvation comes in the form of someone sweeping the floors. The chapter closes on a tight shot of Maria, her face calm, her eyes resolute, moving as if nothing has happened, yet everything has changed. The soft hum of the city below mirrors the silent tension in the room. A storm has passed, but its residue lingers. And the audience is left with a question that hangs in the air. How could a cleaning lady, unnoticed by the world, change the fate of a fallen titan? The answer is coming, slowly, inexorably, one quiet step at a time. James Whitmore's world continued to crumble, and now, for the first time, everyone could see it. The newspapers didn't mince words. Failed mogul, empire collapses, Whitmore's fortune vanishes. The words scrawled across glossy pages and glowing screens cut deeper than any boardroom betrayal. Every banker's polite excuse, every lawyer's clipped explanation, every glance from former allies carried a quiet accusation: he had lost. He could no longer command respect, could no longer intimidate with money or influence. He was a man exposed, a man stripped bare. Each rejection, each cold stare, was another nail in the coffin of his pride. He wore humiliation like a second skin, heavy and suffocating, a cloak he could not shrug off. The penthouse, once a symbol of power and control, now felt like a gilded cage, its walls echoing his shame. Pictures of awards, expensive art, and accolades seemed to mock him, their silent judgment harsher than any public condemnation. And then there was Maria. She arrived each morning with the quiet authority of someone who knew her own worth. The world overlooked her. The world often ignored her. But she had a clarity, a focus, that James, with all his wealth and experience, could not command anymore. She moved through the penthouse with purpose, cleaning, organizing, straightening, not for recognition, but because she cared about order, about precision, about doing the right thing. Her presence was a calm current, steadying the storm swirling around him, even if he refused to admit it. One day, his frustration boiled over. A vase, a simple decorative object, had been misplaced, or so he thought. "Can't you do anything right?" he snapped, his voice sharp and accusing, reverberating through the marble halls. His anger startled even him, a raw edge that came from desperation rather than rage. Maria paused. She looked him in the eye, her gaze unwavering, unshaken by the power he once wielded. "Sir, maybe it's not about the vase," she said, her tone measured, calm, almost gentle, yet carrying a weight that made him falter. "Maybe it's about learning where you went wrong." There was no fear in her words. There was only truth, unflinching and steady. James blinked. He had been obeyed his whole life, followed unquestioned, revered for his success. No one had ever spoken to him like that. No one had ever dared to see his failure and meet it with clarity instead of pity. At first, he scoffed, pride still whispering in his ear that she was just a cleaning lady, someone beneath notice. But as days passed, he began to notice other things. The way she managed the household with efficiency that mirrored his own corporate precision, the way she quietly suggested better ways to organize his documents, to review his finances, to stabilize what he thought was beyond repair. At first, he dismissed her. But he could not deny it for long. She had a mind for detail, for problem-solving, for strategy. And unlike anyone else in his world, she did not bow to him, did not flatter, did not seek favor. She spoke truth, and truth had a way of cutting deeper than any scandal or market crash. Creditors came, their faces pale, their patience thin. Each encounter was a fresh blow. "Mr. Whitmore, I'm afraid there's nothing left," one banker said, voice heavy with sympathy that stung like acid. James's jaw tightened. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of finality. His empire, his identity, had been reduced to nothing more than paper, promises, and public scorn. Maria stood nearby, silently observing, her calm a mirror to his chaos. She whispered advice when needed, small but critical insights that he had overlooked, suggestions that held the power to change outcomes he had thought irreversible. One evening, after a particularly brutal day of legal threats and public humiliation, James confronted her. His voice cracked, eyes glistening with unspilled tears. "Why are you helping me? I've treated you like you were invisible." His words hung heavy in the room, a mixture of shame and frustration, fear and desperation. Maria did not flinch. She turned to him slowly, placing a hand lightly on the edge of the table, and said, "Because sometimes the world only teaches you through humility." There was no malice, no judgment in her tone, just truth. Her words sank deep, deeper than any financial loss, deeper than the humiliation he suffered outside these walls. James felt something shift inside him, an uneasy stirring that he could neither control nor name. For the first time, he understood that power, real power, was not measured by money or influence. It was measured by respect, by dignity, by the ability to see the value in those whose society ignored. Maria, who scrubbed floors and polished counters, held more wisdom and moral authority than any boardroom full of yes-men ever had. He realized he had been blind, caught in the illusion of wealth and titles, forgetting that the world could crumble in a single day, but integrity and wisdom remained unshaken. Days turned into weeks. Each interaction with Maria chipped away at his pride, but also built something new, a sense of perspective he had never known. She reorganized his accounts, suggested investments he had overlooked, and reminded him of principles he had abandoned in pursuit of wealth. He resisted at first, stubborn and arrogant, but the results were undeniable. Slowly, the man who had been humiliated, stripped of status and wealth, began to see a path forward, not just to regain what he had lost, but to rebuild with intention, integrity, and respect. The emotional tension escalated with every passing day. James's ego fought against every suggestion, every correction, every piece of wisdom Maria offered. Yet, in the quiet moments, when the city lights glimmered below the penthouse windows and only the soft hum of the elevator broke the silence, he began to notice the stark contrast. He was fragile, broken, fumbling, while Maria was steadfast, composed, unshakable. She carried herself with a strength he had never earned, and that strength was now guiding him in ways he could not have imagined. By the end of this chapter, James Whitmore was no longer the titan he had been. He was humbled, exhausted, but learning. He had begun to understand that wealth without respect was meaningless, that power without dignity was fragile, and that success without humility was an illusion. Maria, unnoticed by the world, had become his teacher, his anchor, his silent force of change. The stage was perfectly set for what was coming next, a reversal he could not yet imagine, a moment when the balance of power would shift, and the world would witness that sometimes the strongest influence comes from the most unexpected places. As the night fell over the city, James sat alone in the living room, papers spread out before him, head in his hands. Maria, quietly finishing her work, glanced up at him once, and in her eyes was a silent promise. The path ahead would be difficult, but he would not walk it alone. And for the first time in weeks, James allowed himself to wonder, not about what he had lost, but about what he might still gain. The camera lingers on Maria's resolute face, steady and unshaken, as the soft light of the penthouse bathes her in a quiet glow. She is unremarkable to the world, yet extraordinary in ways James is only beginning to understand. And the audience is left with the tension of a story far from over, waiting for the moment when the underdog shows her true power. The storm hit like a warning, rattling the windows and shaking the penthouse with thunder that seemed to echo James Whitmore's own inner turmoil. Rain lashed against the glass, blurring the city below, washing it in sheets of gray, and inside, James sat slumped over his desk, exhaustion etched into every line of his face. The world outside had become a mirror of his life, chaotic, relentless, unforgiving. And yet, amid the storm, there was Maria. She moved with calm precision, methodical and unhurried, as if the weather and the world itself had no power over her. She was wiping down the edge of a counter when James, in a fit of frustrated curiosity, finally asked the question that had been pressing in his mind for weeks. "Who are you, really?" Maria paused, the cloth in her hand folding neatly against the granite surface. She did not smile, did not laugh, did not immediately answer. There was a stillness about her, a quiet gravity that made the space between them feel charged, heavy with expectation. Then she spoke, slowly, carefully, each word deliberate. "I was someone else before this." Her eyes met his, steady, unwavering. "I worked with numbers, strategy, businesses. I helped small companies grow when they had nothing. I built solutions when others said it couldn't be done." James blinked, disbelief written across his face. He had thought he knew this woman, had passed her in the halls, had barely noticed her existence beyond the polite nod or fleeting smile. And now, the truth hit him like lightning. The very person he had overlooked, underestimated, had been capable of brilliance, of vision, of power he had never imagined. The realization settled in slowly, like cold rain soaking through his clothes, chilling him to the bone. She had been forced into this life by misfortune, by circumstance, yet her mind, her intellect, her capability had not diminished. It had been hidden, waiting for the right moment, or perhaps, waiting for him to finally recognize it. James's pride wavered, crumbling further under the weight of his own ignorance. He had treated her as someone beneath notice, someone unworthy of his attention, yet here she was, holding the solutions to a recovery he had thought impossible. Maria's voice cut through the storm outside, calm and assured. "We can rebuild, but not the way you think. Not by reclaiming the past. We start with what remains, with what is real. Strategy, humility, patience, and heart." She laid out her plan with precision, pointing to the scattered papers and financial statements, mapping out ways to stabilize investments, appease creditors, and rebuild influence, not just for profit, but for purpose. James leaned forward, incredulous. "You're serious?" he asked, almost unable to believe the audacity of her vision. She nodded, her gaze unwavering. "Every step, if done with care, will bring you back. Not as the man you were, but as the man you should be." The next few days felt surreal. He followed her instructions, hesitating at first, skeptical, but then the results appeared almost immediately. A creditor softened, willing to extend terms. An old partner returned with renewed trust. Investments stabilized, showing signs of growth that had seemed impossible. Every step, guided by Maria's insight, was a revelation. James watched, stunned, as the world he thought had abandoned him began to shift under her quiet guidance. The balance of power, once so firmly in his own hands, had shifted, quietly, almost invisibly, to her. He found himself observing her late at night, working alone in the dim glow of the desk lamp. Her hands moved with confidence and precision, her mind orchestrating moves he could barely comprehend. He realized that he was not witnessing a cleaning lady at work, he was witnessing a master strategist. And the shame hit him in waves, the knowledge that he had doubted her, overlooked her, dismissed her, even while his own empire lay in ruin. "I should have seen this before," he whispered to the empty room, a confession to himself as much as to her. Yet Maria did not seek praise. She did not demand recognition. She worked with quiet determination, her satisfaction coming not from accolades, but from the simple act of correcting what had been broken. And James, humbled, began to see what true leadership looked like, what real strength was. It was not in titles, wealth, or the fear of others. It was in integrity, in vision, in the ability to guide, protect, and uplift those who had been ignored or underestimated. The emotional climax built gradually, tension crackling in the penthouse like the storm outside. One night, as the wind howled and rain battered the windows, James finally broke. He stood behind her, observing, and said, "You've done more in a week than I've done in months, than I ever thought possible." How can this be? Maria did not turn to him immediately. She continued her work, then finally looked over her shoulder, eyes steady. Because it's not about what you've lost, sir. It's about what you're willing to learn now. It's about humility and respect. It's about seeing the truth in people, not titles. The words pierced deeper than any financial report or public humiliation. James felt a weight lift and settle all at once. The man who had wielded power without empathy, who had defined himself by wealth and control, was learning what it meant to follow, to trust, and to recognize genius where society had blinded him. Maria's hidden brilliance was now his compass, her resilience his anchor, and the empire he thought was lost was slowly being rebuilt, not through arrogance, but through wisdom. By the end of the chapter, James Whitmore was no longer the same man who had collapsed at his desk weeks earlier. He had begun to shed his pride, his need to dominate, his obsession with appearances. He had learned that true power was not in money alone, but in vision guided by integrity, and that the most unlikely person could hold the key to salvation. Maria, who had once moved quietly in the background, now commanded a presence that could not be ignored. She was the unseen hand steering him toward redemption, a quiet force with the ability to transform a fallen titan into a man who could rise again. As the storm outside subsided, leaving the city glimmering wet and reflective, James sat quietly, watching her work. His eyes softened, and for the first time, he did not see a cleaning lady. He saw a guide, a teacher, a strategist, a force of nature that he had been foolish enough to underestimate. The camera lingers on her calm, resolute face, backlit by the soft glow of the desk lamp, her expression unshaken by the world outside or the chaos within. She had stepped from the shadows, not seeking recognition, not demanding gratitude, but revealing the truth, that those society ignores often carry the power to change everything. The chapter closes on James, leaning back in his chair, head tilted, eyes tracing her movements with awe and newfound respect. The narrative tension is palpable. The audience is left with the sense that the true reversal, the full revelation of power, wisdom, and redemption, is only moments away. And in that quiet, charged room, one thing is certain. The balance of power has shifted, and the world James thought he controlled is now under the guidance of someone he once overlooked. The stage is set. The next chapter promises transformation, and the story is far from over. The morning sun spilled gold across the city, reflecting off the glass towers that had once symbolized James Whitmore's empire, a reminder of both the heights he had reached and the depths from which he had fallen. Inside his penthouse, the air was different now, lighter, charged with purpose and quiet respect. James stood near the windows, the city sprawled beneath him like a living, breathing entity, yet it no longer intimidated him. Beside him, Maria moved with the same calm grace she had always carried, adjusting papers on the desk, straightening frames, quietly orchestrating the details of a world he once believed only he could control. But now he saw clearly. She had been the architect of his redemption, the unseen hand that had guided him through the chaos of humiliation, loss, and despair. Today was different. He had invited a small group of investors, former colleagues, and advisors, people who had once questioned his competence, who had once looked at him with pity or disdain. They arrived expecting a man still fractured, still humbled, still at the mercy of misfortune. But James had changed. Not only had he regained control of his financial stability, but he had also rebuilt something far more valuable, his character. And Maria, who had once been invisible in their eyes, now stood beside him, recognized for the genius, wisdom, and integrity she had quietly carried all along. She was no longer just the cleaning lady. She was the strategist, the savior, the moral compass of the room. James began the meeting, his voice steady, confident but tempered with humility. He addressed the room with honesty, a stark contrast to the arrogance that had once defined him. "I want to start by acknowledging someone who, for too long, has been unseen," he said, glancing at Maria. The room fell silent, the weight of his words settling into the bones of everyone present. "Maria has been the reason we are here today. She has taught me more about leadership, strategy, and integrity than anyone in this room ever has. Her guidance has not only saved my business but changed me as a person." Gasps rippled through the group. Eyes widened. Heads turned. This was unexpected. For a moment, the room, filled with titans of finance and corporate power, was humbled by the recognition of someone society had overlooked. Maria's face remained calm, poised, almost serene, yet the subtle strength in her gaze spoke volumes. She had never sought this moment. She had never demanded recognition. And yet, here it was, public acknowledgement of her brilliance, her resilience, her unwavering moral authority. The room seemed to inhale collectively, as if they had suddenly been reminded that true value is not always visible, and greatness is not always loud. James felt a quiet satisfaction settle into his chest. Not pride, not ego, but gratitude, deep and profound. After the formalities, James pulled her aside, his voice low, filled with emotion he could no longer suppress. "I owe you everything, Maria. You didn't just clean my house. You cleaned my soul. You saw me at my worst and still guided me. I don't even know how to begin to thank you." His eyes glistened, and for a moment, the years of arrogance, of isolation, of believing he was untouchable, seemed to melt away. Maria looked at him, calm, steady, a gentle smile playing on her lips. "Sir," she said softly, "it was never about owing. It's about recognizing what really matters. Humility, respect, seeing people for who they are, not what they appear to be. That is the lesson." Her words lingered in the room, quiet but resonant, carrying a truth that would not be forgotten. The day unfolded like a revelation. Meetings went smoothly, decisions were made with precision, and James navigated discussions with clarity and empathy he had never possessed before. Investors and partners who had once doubted him now listened intently, impressed not only by the turnaround in his business but by the transformation in his character. Maria remained a quiet presence, her eyes alert, her guidance subtle but unmistakable. She moved through the room with confidence and grace, a reminder that influence is not always loud, and that true leadership often comes from the background, guiding with wisdom rather than command. By afternoon, the penthouse was alive with a sense of possibility. James watched Maria as she reviewed documents, adjusted charts, and offered insight with calm authority. The man who had once been defined by ego and wealth now understood something far more profound. Power without integrity is fleeting, wealth without humility is hollow, and success achieved alone, without respect and dignity, is meaningless. He felt a quiet awe, a deep respect for the woman who had changed everything in his life without ever demanding recognition. Her influence was not performative, it was transformative, quiet but undeniable. The emotional climax of the day came unexpectedly. A former rival, a man who had once publicly mocked James's failures, approached him with hesitation, a mixture of respect and disbelief in his eyes. "Mr. Whitmore, I don't know how to say this, but whatever you've done, it's remarkable. And Maria, she's extraordinary." James nodded, gratitude spilling over his features. "Yes," he said simply, "she is. And I've learned that sometimes, the people we overlook are the very ones who carry the lessons we most need." The rival's expression softened, a quiet acknowledgement that the world is not always as it seems. As evening fell, the city lights twinkled like scattered stars beneath the penthouse windows. James and Maria stood side by side, surveying the skyline. He no longer felt the weight of failure. He felt the clarity of rebirth. He had been humbled, taught by someone he had dismissed, and in that process, he had become more than he was before. Wealth remained, yes, but it was now tempered by wisdom. Influence remained, yes, but it was now guided by integrity. Power remained, yes, but it was now coupled with respect, for himself, for others, and for the unseen heroes of the world. Maria continued her work, not for accolades, not for fame, not for money, but for the quiet satisfaction of knowing she had changed a life in a single, profound way. And James understood that this was the most important lesson of all. True greatness is not measured by what you control, but by the respect you give, the humility you practice, and the unseen wisdom you honor. Sometimes, the salvation we seek does not arrive in grand gestures or towering speeches. It comes quietly, patiently, from those society ignores, those whom we assume are powerless, those who carry the courage to act when no one is watching. The final moments lingered in silence, cinematic in their stillness. James turned to Maria, his voice soft but firm, carrying the weight of a man transformed. "You've changed me. I will never forget this. I will never forget you." She smiled faintly, her eyes steady, and replied, "It was never about changing you. It was about reminding you, and everyone else, that dignity, respect, and wisdom are the true measures of a life well lived." The words settled in the room like a quiet benediction, resonating far beyond the penthouse, far beyond the city, far beyond James himself. The camera pulls back slowly, capturing the skyline glimmering in twilight, the hum of life continuing below, indifferent yet aware, as the narrative settles into a profound truth. Wealth and status are fleeting, but humility, respect, and the unseen power of integrity endure. Maria, quiet and unassuming, fades into the background of the scene, yet her presence lingers, a testament to the idea that sometimes salvation, and the greatest transformation, comes from the most unexpected places. James Whitmore, once a fallen titan, now stands rebuilt, not just in fortune, but in soul. And the audience is left with awe, reflection, and the timeless lesson that true power is not in what you have, but in what you honor, recognize, and respect in the world around you.